Welcome to the Legacy Leaders Podcast. Are you doing the best for your client to help them create their legacy? Are you creating a plan that goes far beyond finances to help people ensure that it becomes the driving force behind all decisions? On this podcast, hosts Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller will help you with growing your practice and your clients' peace of mind. Together, they bring the best and brightest minds to share with you how to help your clients develop their best legacy. And now, here are your hosts, Katie Beth and Stan.
Welcome back to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your hosts, Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. Our guest today is an expert in fundraising, business growth, and mergers and acquisitions, David Horne. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Katie Beth.
We are very excited from all of the talk we had before we hit the record button. I know we have a lot to talk about, so we're going to dive right in. But for our listeners, could you take just a few minutes and tell us a little bit of your background, kind of your history, and then how you ended up where you are today that led you to write your book, all of those things. So start us off with a little bit of history and how you wound up where you are.
Yep, great. So I'm originally from Vancouver, British Columbia. I trained as a chartered accountant or a CPA with Price Waterhouse, which is now PwC, but back then was Price Waterhouse. And when I qualified with them, I was offered an opportunity to transfer to their Zurich office in Switzerland. So in the summer of 1987, my wife and I, we'd been married 4 years at that stage. We packed up our clothes into 4 suitcases, sold off what few possessions we had, jumped on board an airplane with one-way tickets and a 2-year employment contract, and that was 37 years ago. So I spent my 2 years at Price Waterhouse in Zurich, and then I was offered an incredible job by my largest client, the Swiss subsidiary of NCR, the tech company originally known as National Cash Register. But they were very much a computer company by that stage. And I was offered the job to become their controller in Switzerland, which I did for 4 years. And then I was offered the opportunity to move to the UK with NCR to be the controller of their UK subsidiary operations. So in the summer of 93, my wife and I and our 2 young daughters moved from Zurich to London, and we've been in London ever since. I stayed with NCR/AT&T because NCR had been bought out by AT&T at that stage for another few years, and then I left and went and spent 3 years with the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is a wonderful organization. But after a couple of years, I decided that it and I were not really meant for each other. So I left it at the end of 1999 thinking I was going to get a job with a .com. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But I ended up landing a role as the European CFO of a acquisitive PR agency group headquartered out of New York that had just expanded into London. And over the next 2 years, we had a brief to build an agency network in Europe, and we had New York's checkbook. So in 2 years, we acquired 7 PR agencies, which was a lot of fun. And then I was approached to join a company listed here on the stock exchange in London that was a digital media and publishing group that was growing by acquisition. When I joined, sales were about $1 million. And 3 years later, when I left, sales were $27 million. Sorry, pounds, that's pound, but let's just leave it in dollars. So say dollars, but it's more. But it went from 1 to 27. So it tripled in the first year, it tripled again in the second year, and it tripled again in the third year. And that was pretty exciting. And then I was headhunted to join another company listed on the stock exchange here in London, which was an auction business. And we completed the acquisition of our largest global competitor, another auction company that was headquartered out of LA. That was a deal that was worth about $40 million. And we did a huge global integration, put the companies together, came back to the stock market and said everything that we said it was in the prospectus was done. It's all looking good. The numbers are on track. And a week later, Lehman Brothers went bust. And in the next 6 months, about $10 million of expected revenue failed to materialize. And the chief executive was fired. It wasn't his fault, but somebody had to go. I threw my hat in the ring, but the board decided to go with someone from the outside. And when he came on board, pretty much from day one, he and I were not going to get on. So I waited 6 months and decided, okay, this is time. I had a call with the chairman and we had a grown-up conversation and I left the business. And I've been running my own company ever since. And 5 years ago, I published my book, Add Then Multiply, which sets out my FACE methodology, FACE, which stands for Fund, Acquire, Consolidate, Exit. And today I work exclusively with entrepreneurial businesses on scale up strategies through raising capital, buying companies, and ultimately selling companies. Last week, I completed my 29th M&A transaction, the sale of a PR agency that I've been working with since 2013. And that was in a deal that was worth a little over $10 million.
So, a very interesting, very varied background. So, I appreciate you sharing that with us. A lot of successes in your career and interesting turns, and then some things that didn't go well in there as well. Tell us, having been through all of that, what are some of the lessons and some of the takeaways that you learned from the career path that you've taken?
Probably the biggest lesson came when I left the auction business, because I didn't immediately go into launching Add Then Multiply. I actually had what I now describe as my midlife crisis moment, and I tried to launch a wine business, which was tremendous fun. I met some amazing people. I got to taste some incredible wine, but I found that the economics of the wine industry are very, very challenging. And I think probably the biggest thing for me at the time was I had never sold anything to anybody before. I was known as being, the CFO of a listed company. So, kind of had that background. And I thought, well, I've got a great network of people in the financial world. And of course, they'll buy wine from me. And they didn't. So that was a big, big learning experience. And when I finally kind of came to grips with the fact that the wine business really wasn't going to keep my family in the style to which they'd become accustomed, that's when I went back to my knitting. But I would say I still have the wine business today. I'm its biggest customer by some measure.
You would fit in well with Stan and with me. So, talk to us a little bit more about Add and then Multiply. Can you walk us through sort of those steps? I know step one you had mentioned earlier was getting your business ready. Sort of walk us through the process of Add and then Multiply, this process you've streamlined and come up with.
Sure. Yeah. So the faith methodology, and the reality is you can step in at pretty much any point along it. But let's just say I'm working with a client and we're starting out and we're going to build the company and ultimately exit. So we'll go into a client and we'll work with them on the development of their business strategy. And typically we're looking at clients that have sales of at least $2 or $3 million and up. But anything smaller than that, it really becomes a bit more challenging to raise any significant sums of money without the founders of the company getting heavily diluted. So we'll go in and we'll work with the client on the development of a strategy where we'll say, okay, so here's your business. What are the kinds of businesses that you could look to acquire? Where are the areas in your industry that you could expand? Are you looking to expand geographically? So you guys are in Arkansas. So if you want to expand into, I don't know, Mississippi, or you want to go really far, you want to go all the way up to Washington State, so you can come over the border and see me in Vancouver. Whatever your geographic expansion is, or if you've got a US wide business, you might want to expand into Europe, say. So you could look at buying companies there, or you might say, well, actually, we're in this industry and here's an upstream supplier. I could actually buy the upstream supplier and have an assured supply of what I need, and potentially make life a little more difficult for my competitors if I'm one of the leading suppliers in the industry. Or you could buy a downstream customer, again, to just manage the flow. So we'll look at the whole range of possibilities strategically, and then we'll put together a plan using my FACE methodology, FACE, fund, acquire, consolidate, exit. So the first step is obviously fund. That's going out and identifying, we need to raise some money. So let's go out and look at where we can do that, whether that's through venture capital, private equity, family offices, angel investors, crowdfunding, whatever. There are many, many routes that you can go down, but let's look at what's the right one for the business. And then with the acquisition in mind, once we've secured the funding, we can complete the purchase. Those two really tend to go hand in hand, because you don't want to go out and raise, say, $2 million and then find an acquisition that's going to cost you 10. So they kind of go hand in hand, but I like to line up the funding before I make the acquisition so that you can actually pay for it. Because sometimes in deals, and I've experienced this at firsthand, where there might be an element of consideration that's payable on the date of acquisition and an element that's deferred down the line. And I actually had a situation with one of my clients last year where we sold a company to a buyer with deferred consideration. And we put a clause in the contract that if they didn't pay the deferred consideration, we would buy the company back for $1. Now, I've seen that clause in contracts many, many times. I have never, until last summer, actually bought back a company for $1. So those two go hand in hand. So it's raising the money to buy a company. And then we move into the consolidate stage, the C of faith. And that's really where the rubber hits the road. That's where you're looking at taking two businesses and putting them together. And when I think back to experiences in my career, I mentioned the NCR AT&T deal. I mean, for your older listeners, they may remember that it was done in the early 90s. It was widely viewed until the time of the dot-com boom and some of the crazy deals then. It was widely viewed as the worst corporate M&A transaction in history because the cultures of these two companies were so different. And it was incredible looking back on it to see how badly the culture change initiatives that they were trying to achieve happened. And so I've always really focused very carefully on a client. Okay, so how are you going to manage bringing these two cultures together? What are you going to do? What are you going to do with particular clients? I had one client that was in the PR sector and it acquired another company, and two of their largest clients were direct competitors to each other. So we had to really carefully, strategically assess how we manage that. You have to look at all of the people issues. How do you bring in some of the senior people from a company that you've bought so that the people in that company can see, hey, this isn't just someone coming in and taking us over and crushing us, but actually they're recognizing talent within our company and helping to build that. And you can repeat that kind of fund, acquire, consolidate stage over a number of years. I mean, the middle company that I talked about, the digital media and publishing company, we acquired 8 businesses in 3 years. And as I said, we tripled the size of the business 3 years running as a result of that. So you can, rinse, repeat, I think it goes. So, do that. And then ultimately you'll come to a point where you say, okay, I've had enough. I want to move on. My investors want to move on. We want to exit. Let's sell the business. And again, it's actually the selling process. Once you've been through the acquisition process, the selling process intellectually is the same because you're simply sitting on the other side of the table in a deal. But emotionally, it's very, very different, especially for someone who's started a business and built it up, because they're very emotionally attached to the business, to the people inside it. Oftentimes, they feel like the people who are in the business are sort of the extended family. So it's working through some of the emotional issues, as well as obviously the specific practicalities of, what do you have to do in the transaction? How do you negotiate the agreements? How do you make sure the terms are fair, et cetera, et cetera?
No, that makes perfect sense. And in there, it kind of sparked my attention. You mentioned culture clash as an issue you've certainly seen. Having walked through this process with multiple businesses, what are some of the other common mistakes you see people making?
I mean, the culture side is probably the biggest one. The next one I would say is particularly in a business where it's a people-related thing, like a PR agency. So of the 29 deals I've completed, 9 of them have been in the PR industry, but any kind of a service-based business where your assets walk out the door every night, the most important thing for a buyer to consider is, I know that the people that I've bought this company from are going to be with me for a period of years while they go through the earn-out process. But after 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, they're going to be gone. How do I take over the relationships with their key customers? That's probably the biggest one, because if you don't do that in 2 or 3 or 5 years when they're gone, those customers will go elsewhere. So building that relationship with those key customers is really critical. Likewise, if there are any core suppliers, if you get into a business that's, say, in the manufacturing sector and there's a specialist supplier that is the best one for that particular industry, you want to make sure you're building relationships with those. And indeed with the people within the company so that you identify them. As I said, it's often very clever to bring in members of the management team from the company that you acquired into your bigger management team for the group as a whole. And by not doing that, you can really alienate the people in the company that have been bought. And then I guess the last thing, and this applies to any business, but it's communicate. Let people know what's going on. Because a lot of people, there will be a transaction and the company's been sold and you're working there, and all of a sudden you're thinking, well, is my job safe? What's going to happen to me and my family? Can I afford to make my mortgage payments? I've got college fees coming up. How am I going to deal with this? So communicate what you're doing openly, honestly with people, and show that you're delivering on what you're going to achieve.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, Stan, I know I've stolen all of
Yep.
David's time with my questions so far. What questions do you have?
Good question. I do have questions. So, David, I know that you've been involved in transactions where a business was grown from X to 10X and then exited, right?
Yep.
I also suspect you've had some opportunity to be inside of businesses where there was a real ambition, a desire to grow, but they were not successful. I'm really curious to hear your take on what differentiates those two? Is it a difference in mindset, or are there other factors that are observable that you could discern?
I will quote a former British prime minister from the 1960s. I can't remember which one it was, but when asked the question about those kind of challenges, he responded to a young reporter, "Events, dear boy, events." And I'll go back to the auction company where we acquired our largest competitor, put the two companies together. We were operating in 16 countries around the world. They were in 10. We only had 3 where there was a crossover: Germany, the UK, and the USA. And so we put together a plan that said, we're going to put these two companies together. We're going to rip out a ton of costs from these countries because they happen to be the biggest ones for both businesses. So we're going to rip out a ton of cost, and that was going to result in the cost savings that justified the investment that we pushed to presented to our investors, and led to them putting the money into the business that enabled us to complete the acquisition. When then Lehman's went bust and we lost the $10 million in the last quarter of the year that we'd been expecting, we then had to go through, and we'd already ripped $5 million of cost out of the organization. We had then had to go through and cut another $6 million out of the organization. And when you've kind of right-sized a company on a global basis, and all of a sudden you've got to go back and do it again, that's where it's really, really difficult, because there was no fat left in that company. It was a lean company, and we had to cut out muscle, and we even had to cut into the bone in some places just in order to survive. So you've got to be willing to make tough decisions like that. Another example, at the Digital Media and Publishing Group, we acquired a company that had operations in the UK and in Brussels. And the UK operation was fantastic, a really strong business, and the Brussels operation was bleeding. And literally the day that we completed the acquisition, I got on a train from London to Brussels and I went into the office of the Brussels operation. On the morning I arrived, it had 13 employees. On the evening when I left, it had 2. So I had to fire 11 people on the day of acquisition. A tough job to do, but I guess given my background and my roles, I was the one who got to do it. I had 3 gin and tonics on the train coming home.
Well, great that you can have that Eurostar and make that journey easy,
Yeah.
right? So, what wisdom do you bring? So, you've been through a lot of acquisitions where you bring these companies in. It just seems like anytime that happens, you've got personalities. Those people have a kind of hierarchy in the business they were in, and now you throw them in the tent with these new people, and they've got to figure out how they fit, where they fit in this new hierarchy. Are there secret strategies, skills that you bring to that interaction on the front end that can minimize the toxicity of that?
Yeah, and in reality, Stan, it kind of boils down to experience. And so if we take the Brussels example again, so by the middle of the afternoon, the 2 people who were left were shell-shocked. And I sat down with them and I said, look, I understand how you feel, because I've been in your shoes before, where I've been on the end of a company that was acquired, and I've seen colleagues of mine go, and you're probably feeling, not only shocked, but maybe a bit of, well, why me? Why am I still here and they're all gone? And so I've been in your shoes before. I've been in your colleagues' shoes before, where I've been one of the people who's been fired. And I've been in my shoes before, where I'm the guy who has to be the one, wielding the axe. So I kind of was able to position to these people that I knew what they were feeling. I knew what their former colleagues were feeling, and that they knew that this wasn't the first time I'd had to do something like that. So I really try and focus, when there's hard news like that to deliver, I really try and focus on a human connection, and, not so much focusing on the well, there's this and there's that, and this is why, etc. But really trying to get under the skin and understand the feelings and empathize with what those people are feeling.
Yeah, I can only imagine, what that's like. And so I would think that being proactive, you being reassuring, I guess the people that remained, there's some level of reassurance you give them, right? You chose them, they're in, right? So you do that. But it seems like, I don't know, do you plan, like, how do you initially acculturate these two different cultures? Do you have a big cocktail party? Do you plan a weekend retreat in the country? What are there like tricks of the trade?
Typically, what you'll do is you'll get the top leaders or owners of the two companies together for a planning session, and you will often do it like a retreat. It's often good to have someone who's a facilitator, just in case things start to go a bit off the rails, that they're skilled at bringing the people back on stream. But typically you're looking on the basis that it's a friendly acquisition as opposed to a hostile one. Right. You're looking to bring the two sides of the transaction together because they both want the transaction to happen. When it's a hostile situation, it's quite different. I've only ever been involved in one hostile takeover, and that was when AT&T bought NCR, but I was way, way down the hierarchy, so I wasn't involved in any of those discussions. But I know that was a hostile takeover bid. So yeah, they happen. But no, I mean, my focus is very much on parties that want to see a transaction go ahead. And so you bring the principals together to map these things out, to talk about who the key customers are, to talk about who the key players are, to plan out, okay, from day one, what are we going to announce in terms of, what's the new management team, and how do we make sure we can bring people from both companies together in that structure and give them meaningful roles, not just, here's so-and-so from the company we acquired and we're going to give them this title, but it doesn't actually mean anything.
So given a little self-reflection, what would you say is the unique skill set that you bring to those interactions?
The unique skill set that I bring. That's a great question.
Why you?
Yeah. I bring 40 years of business experience, 29 M&A transactions, doing business around the world. I've lived and worked in 3 countries, Canada, Switzerland, and the UK. I speak 4 languages, German, French, and Italian, as well as English. Not all of them fluent. I am fluent in German. My French is okay. My Italian's basic, but enough. So, just kind of, I call it life skills combined with, solid finance skills, solid experience and all of that. But again, coming back to it, ultimately, it's human beings dealing with other human beings. And I think it's really important to bring that together on a human level and address concerns that people will have. And, they might be completely illogical, but someone has deep-seated feelings and you've got to be able to address them.
So I'm hearing that your primary strategy for multiplying the like 10x growth is built around the idea of acquisition. Do you have other paths, other channels?
There are certainly other paths and channels. I mean, organic growth, driving marketing and stuff, that's not my background or expertise. There are plenty of people who specialize in that. The reality is, unless you're in a really, really hot industry that's absolutely exploding, organic growth is hard work and takes a long time. You might be able to grow your company 10 or 15% a year, maybe 20 if you're lucky, but that kind of growth is hard work. It's expensive. It takes time. You're constrained by the ability of your business to generate cash flows. Whereas if you have the ability to raise capital and go out and buy another company, you can double your size overnight. I mean, again, that digital media and publishing group, we tripled year on year 3 times. And during that process, there were 2 acquisitions that doubled the size of the company. When I look at the auction business, we grew probably 45, 50% through the acquisition that we made. So just all of a sudden a one-off, there you go. And the other key thing, let's take geographic expansion. So you're a US business and you're expanding into Europe. You've got to come in there, figure things out, understand the lie of the land, different legal, different customs, et cetera, or you buy a company that's already there and it's got everything set up and ready to run and it's got customers and it's got employees. So it's an accelerated
right.
wet method to achieve growth.
you've got to raise money to do that. So what wisdom, what insight do you bring to how to raise money?
Well, I mean, the key thing is to know what you're raising money for. And if you're raising money for an M&A transaction, then there are specific investors, whether it's debt or equity investors, there are specific investors who focus on those kinds of deals. They like to support those kinds of deals. And so you strike up relationships with them. And I always recommend to people, strike up these kinds of relationships before you actually need them. Go out and talk to them and say, hey, I'm working in this business. This is who we are. This is what we do. We're thinking in a couple of years' time, we'll have grown to a certain size where actually raising some money and doing some transactions makes sense. And I just wanted to get to know you and for you to get to know us and, start off casually, have a chat over a cup of coffee and take it forward from there.
How do you find them?
Research, networking. I mean, a lot of it is networking. A lot of it's research based. The best way to get into any of those businesses is to get an introduction from someone who already knows them. And what I often say to founders is, let's say you're out, you're whatever industry you're in, but know who your competitors are and know who of your competitors might have had funding, and find out who they've had funding from. Or actually, not your competitors, but people who are in a similar industry. Because your competitors might not want to share, but people who are in a similar industry kind of more broadly. What I've found is founders of companies are often very happy to talk to other founders of companies and share their experience. And so I say, let's say you found company X and company X has been backed by investor ABC. So you reach out to the founder of company X and say, hey, I came across your company. I see you were funded by ABC. I'm considering approaching them for funding in a year's time. Would just love to hear what your experience has been. What's it been like? Was it a great experience? Any tips that you can suggest? And again, build a relationship with that person. Start out with a Zoom call like we're having, and then go and meet them for a cup of coffee. And if that goes well, take them out for lunch. And just build that human connection. And then when the time is right, say, hey, Stan, could you now introduce me to your main investment guy at ABC? And Stan will say, yeah, sure, happy to, and make the introduction. And there you go, you're in. The other route that a lot of founders take is they just cold submit pitch decks. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I'm not saying don't do that. But the reality is it's a lot harder when you do that. I was talking to the managing partner of a medium-sized investment firm in London a few years ago. And he told me that in the previous year, they had received 8,000 applications for funding. And they made 16 investments. So, if you want to have your best shot at being one of those 16, don't just cold submit your deck and hope for the best.
Right. So have you found networking groups, organizations, events, places to go where all these people show up and you can hang out with them, all at once?
They're very hard to get into. I have come across a couple of organizations. I went to one event in Monaco that was all about family offices. And we paid a chunk of money to go to this. And yeah, it was a mixed experience. We didn't come away with an investment. We did meet some interesting people and have some interesting conversations. But yeah, it wasn't the greatest thing. I take the view that you're better off. If you're the founder of a company, hang out with other founders of companies. Find a founder of a company that's been funded. Talk to them and see if they can help you. Definitely go to networking events. You never know who you're going to bump into or sit next to or whatever. And I mean, a great example of that, I was on a flight to Zurich a few years ago, and I had been trying to get into this one investment company, and I'd struck up a conversation with the lady who was sat next to me. And it turns out that she worked for that investment company. She was in their investor relations department. And as we're getting up to get off the plane, I said to her, would you like a copy of my book? And I signed the book, gave it to her. And then I reached out to her on email and we had a coffee and a chat and got to know her. And, so yeah, find creative ways to do it. Again, and so many people in the finance world don't think of this. And I don't mean that to in any way discredit your listeners, but so many people in the finance world don't think about this. But it's human beings dealing with other human beings. Build relationships with people.
We
I
have,
do think
we
that's
have,
that's one place people tend
yeah,
to falter. Sorry, Stan, go ahead.
yeah. No, I'm just saying, we have listeners who, I know we have attorneys, we have financial advisors in particular who have clients who may be thinking about how do I grow, how do I expand, or they may be thinking, how do I exit?
Yep.
And so here in the couple minutes we have left, I mean, any wisdom, any secrets, advice that you've distilled from all these years and all these deals that you'd share with those guys?
Sure. So, I mean, on the exit side, I always say to people, if you're thinking about exit and you're just starting to think about it now, it's going to be 3 years. Because really, if you want to maximize the value of your company, you need to prepare your company. You need to be driving it in certain ways. If you've been running this company for the last 30, 40 years, there's probably a lot of stuff that flows through the books of the company that has nothing to do with the company, but the tax man allows it. You got to clear all of that stuff out. So, if there's a boat on the books, well, get the boat off the books. If there's certain types of expenditure, if your spouse or your children are on the payroll and they don't actually do anything, get them out of there, clear it up, and then focus on, here's my business, and I want to show that this is a business that's capable of growing. Because to maximize your valuation, you want to be showing a growing business. If you've got a declining business, your valuation is going to drop off significantly. I was talking with one of my clients recently who came forward with a potential deal, and it was a company where the sales had dropped year on year for 3 years. So I said to him, look, when you're looking at an attractive company, you might be willing to pay 7, 8, maybe 10 times earnings. In a company that's falling, maybe you're going to pay 2 times earnings, maybe not even 2 times earnings. How fast is it falling? And how confident are you that you can stop the fall? So you want to demonstrate that the company is clean. You want to be showing growth, and you want to have everything in terms of systems, processes, people, documentation, all of that ready, because when time comes to sell the business, a process called due diligence starts. And that's where lawyers and accountants from big firms come into the company and they crawl all over everything. And if you've got any skeletons in the closet, they're going to find them. So get them cleaned out first so that you don't have that. Because I've seen too many deals where they get halfway through the due diligence process and something comes up and the buyer just goes, whoa, that's too big a risk. Don't want to do this. I'll eat the cost I've incurred. I'm walking away.
Good advice.
Great advice. Okay, before we run out of time, David, I do want to take just a second to talk about the book, because all of this wisdom and experience and all of these lessons that you have learned the hard way, you put into a book by the same title on your website, Add and Then Multiply: How Small Businesses Can Think Like Big Businesses and Achieve Exponential Growth. So very quickly, before we run out of time, give our listeners just the short overview of kind of the layout of the book and what they can expect.
Sure. So the book's in 2 main parts. Part 1 sort of sets out my general philosophy on businesses and the kinds of things that business owners need to look at. So there's a chapter called Your Business, which looks at culture, systems, processes, brand, that kind of stuff, big level stuff, and also the people and what are the key roles that you've got to have in place. Then there's a section called Your Head, because there's going to be stuff going on and you're going to have thoughts going through your head and you're going to wonder, well, can I do this? Imposter syndrome might kick in, or you might not believe that it's possible or whatever. So we explore that. And then there's a chapter that just kind of gives my background of the experience I had going kind of all the way back. I mean, I say finance is in my blood. When I was a little boy playing games like Monopoly or anything like that, I was always the banker. My friends just said, oh, will you be the banker? And so I was. So I just did that. And then when I was at university, I had a job working as a teller at the Royal Bank of Canada. And, I remember holding significant sums of cash. I remember one day holding $100,000 in my bare hands. And, I was 19 years old, and that was pretty cool. And so, I've just always been involved in kind of those finance things all my life. So that's played a big role. And then in the middle of the book, between part 1 and part 2, I do a detailed case study of the digital media and publishing group, where I talk through literally deal by deal. Here's what's happened. Here's why we bought them. Here's what happened as a result of the acquisition. I even mentioned the fact that I went to Brussels and fired 11 of the 13 employees that were there, and literally just go through that whole case study. And then part 2 of the book there's a chapter each on fund, acquire, consolidate, and exit. So the chapter on fund goes through the different types of funding that are available, what you need to do, how you approach it. The chapter on acquisition takes you through the steps that you need to look at. The chapter on consolidation is all about putting the companies together. And then the chapter on exit is all about the exit process. And throughout that second half, I put case studies in. So here's what happened in this case. Here's what happened in this case. Here's what happened in this case. So that, otherwise it would be a really dry and boring book. But if you make it here's what happened with this case. For the fund section, I actually made up a company. I called them ABC Limited. It was founded by Annabelle, Brian, and Charlie. And literally, I just took them through all of the stages of funding, from bootstrapping to friends and family, to venture capital, to private equity, to doing an IPO on the stock exchange, and how their funding journey evolved over the course of time.
That is fantastic. So for our readers, be sure that you take some time and check out the book, and let me give you guys all of the information you need. But first, we want to thank you guys for listening. This has been the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your hosts, Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. And our guest today was David Horne. So to connect with David, you can visit addthenmultiply.com. Be sure to check out his book of the same name. You can find it on Amazon. It's also available as an ebook, and you can find it on Audible as well. We will link all of those for you guys in the show notes. And David, thank you again so much for joining us.
My pleasure. I'll just give you one other way that people can reach out to me, which is on LinkedIn, which is my main social media. And I go as David B. Horne. So David B. Horne with an E. And I do that because there are a few other David Hornes when you Google them, but I'm the only David B. Horne.
Perfect. We will link that in the show notes for our listeners as well. David, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller. For more information on them and the show, please visit pinnaclelegacylaw.com. If you like what you've learned today, do share the program with your friends and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.